Welcome to the workshop, Clinical Trials 101, Why They Are Important and What You Should Know. My name is Sue Stewart, and I will be your moderator for this workshop. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Sanofi and Bristol Myers Squibb, whose support helped make this workshop possible. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Ms. Caitlin Guzowski. Ms. Guzowski is the Clinical Research Manager for the Blood and Marrow Transplant, Leukemia, and Cellular Therapy programs at Northside Hospital in Atlanta. She is currently responsible for bringing new and innovative clinical trials to Northside patients by developing relationships with pharmaceutical companies so that patients can access the latest treatments for their blood cancer. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Guzowski.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to meet you all, and thank you for attending our workshop today. Just to give you a little bit of background about myself before we get started in today's presentation, I have been working in the clinical research area for 14 years. 12 of those years have been at Northside Hospital. I started out as a research coordinator and have been manager of the program for the last 2.5 years. I am primarily responsible for all things regulatory and study startup. So starting or getting the trial up and running from the very beginning and working with the trial, the sponsor, our clinical research coordinators and nurses until the very end of the trial. I also help manage the day-to-day activities of our research personnel. And just to give you a little bit of background about the research program at Northside Hospital, we are actually a small subset underneath a larger umbrella of the Central Research Department. We have a robust pipeline. We have about 75 open clinical trials for all of our patients that range from different phases of clinical trials. They range for different diseases and a range of different interventions for those particular blood cancers. I work with 6 physicians, and we have 14 research personnel to identify potential patients for our research trials. Our physicians are extremely involved, and they're very pro-research at our program, as clinical trials are what can change the standard of care. So this is our agenda for today. These are the 4 questions, the 4 basic questions of importance that we want to answer. How, what, why, and where. And my hope is for everyone to gain a little bit more understanding of what clinical trials are all about and why they are so important for cancer treatment development. So here are the 4 questions that we're going to address under the what category. So what exactly is a clinical trial? What are the phases of clinical trials, and what do each of those mean? What is the purpose of a clinical trial, and what does it do? And what happens during a clinical trial as a participant? So for example, like what am I going to be responsible for? What am I going to be doing? So what is a clinical trial? The National Institute of Health, their official definition of a clinical trial is a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. So those are very long words, long sentence. In other words, what that means is that patients participate in a research study that gives them treatment, and then the scientists that are participating in that study, they review those results to determine how that treatment affects their bodies and what the outcomes of those patients are. The most important part to remember about clinical trials is that they are optional, completely optional and voluntary. Patients are given all of the information about the clinical trial up front, and then they can decide on their own whether or not to participate. There are clinical trials where healthy volunteers are needed and others where there are specific diagnoses or diseases that are required. For our talk today, I'm just going to focus on the blood cancer clinical trials, the questions that these trials pose, and the answers that we're trying to get. So if you actually remember back to your middle school and high school science classes, we kind of learned about hypotheses and trying to prove or disprove what we're attempting to address. So clinical trials do just that. They attempt to answer questions posed by scientists. So we're hypothesizing that this particular drug will kill certain leukemia cells. We give the drug to the patient, gather information from your labs, from certain scans that you can undergo, any biopsies, any side effect information that you experience to analyze those results and prove or disprove our hypothesis. So we're always trying to answer new questions or come up with new ways to prove our hypothesis correct. New technologies, new innovations, they're researched so we can get better at preventing, detecting, diagnosing, and treating blood cancer. But most importantly, we want a better patient outcomes. That is the goal of a clinical trial. Get rid of the cancer and enhance patient outcomes. These new interventions must be researched first before they can be approved by the FDA, so that's the Food and Drug Administration, for commercial availability. And that's where the research trial comes in. So there are two types of clinical research trials, observation and interventional. Observation is just as the name says. Scientists are just going to observe patients and collect subjective data. So, for example, we're asking you to fill out a questionnaire to see how you feel today, how you feel a week from now, how you feel a month from now. Here, patients are receiving the standard of care medical interventions, and we just want to know more about that medical treatment that patients are receiving. Interventional is where new treatment is given and investigated. So here we're looking at a brand new treatment or a standard of care treatment for a new indication. So for example, we want to give this certain drug that's already FDA approved to somebody with multiple myeloma instead of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And then we will collect that information and data on how that treatment affects the patient's cancer. So interventional research is how we are developing new and innovative treatments to prevent, detect, diagnose, and treat blood cancer. So that leads us to the phases of clinical research trials. So in interventional trials, there are 3 different phases. We have phase 1, 2, and 3. And then for observational, we have the last phase, which is phase 4. Phases of clinical trials are sequential, and they must go through each phase in order to eventually be approved by the FDA. Each phase is defined by unique characteristics. So first we enroll a very small number of patients to see if our hypothesis is proven in our phase 1 trials. Then we move on to enrolling more patients to see how effective, how well the treatment works in phase 2. And then we see if it's better than the standard of care option that's already out on the market right now, which is your phase 3 trials. Going through each of these first 3 phases to get to the FDA approval takes approximately 8 to 10 years, so a long time. And then the FDA may come back and ask for additional information to be collected about the already approved drug, which leads us to our phase 4 observational trials. Needless to say, a lot of work, time, and effort go into getting one drug approved for commercial use. For our purposes, in the next couple of slides, I'm only going to drill down into the phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, as those are the trials that are pertinent to you for transplant and oncology. Northside Hospital, my program, we do not participate in phase 4 clinical trials as it takes away resources from our interventional trials. But that's not to say that phase 4 is any less important. They're just not a priority for our patients in Northside Hospital. Okay, so a phase 1 clinical trial. In terms of our hypothesis, scientists have seen what the drug does in the lab. So this is initially how a drug gets to the first phase of clinical trials, is we do lab work, extensive lab work in animal models and just in the laboratory. So now we're trying to see if we can see those same results in humans. So these trials are usually first in human trials, meaning it's the first time the drug has been administered in humans. And the drug is usually in very early investigation as we're still trying to figure out if the hypothesis is true or not. In this type of phase of trials, we're focusing on tolerability and the most effective dose of the treatment for patients. So that's why we're looking at a small population of patients to find out what this optimal dose is and to prove if our hypothesis is true. We want to see if this brand new treatment has the same results as what we saw in those early lab studies. Or we want to test a standard treatment, so it's already FDA approved, for that new indication, like giving a graft versus host disease treatment drug before transplant. Could that eventually help prevent graft versus host disease in the future after transplant, just as an example. Because these trials are first in human, we only, like I said before, we only enroll a small amount of patients at a time in order to observe the subjective and objective data in real time. The subjective meaning you are reporting any side effects that you're experiencing after transplant. In the objective data, we're looking at your lab results. We're looking at your bone marrow biopsies or your radiology scans to look at the results. So usually what happens is that only three patients at a time receive this drug. We have to collect those results. We want to have an observation period to see what side effects are incurred and how the drug affects the patient's blood cancer. If we see good results, if we're seeing that the side effects are not that bad, that the drug is tolerable, then another 3 can enroll at a higher dose, and so on and so forth. If we will continue to collect data. If those 3 patients do well, then we can go to the next dose level. Okay, so now we're moving on to a phase 2 clinical trial. So we've gone through the phase 1 trial. We've gone through the phase 1 period. We've seen good results. We've found the tolerated dose for patients. So now we're moving on to a phase 2 trial, and we have less restrictions. We have less restrictions in phase 2 trials. So that means that more patients are eligible to enroll to this particular trial. We're still looking at less than 100 patients, but it's definitely not that small subset. We're trying to collect more data, and here the focus is on effectiveness. So how well does that drug work? So remember, phase 1 was all about tolerability. How can our patients tolerate this drug? Now we're looking at effectiveness. So how well does the drug work? And those observation of side effects. So do the benefits outweigh the risks? Here, we do not have to stagger patients, but we can enroll patients as soon as they volunteer and are eligible for the trial. And the whole rationale behind a phase 2 trial is that we're collecting more data to further confirm that our hypothesis is true. So the last phase of interventional trials is phase 3. Here is where you'll hear the words randomization and placebo. So when I was coordinating patients' care on clinical trials, these are pretty scary words to patients because you don't have any control, and your study team, your clinical trial team, doesn't have any control of the type of treatment that you will get. So I'm here to dispel you of those fears. Phase 3 clinical trials are actually considered the gold standard of research. It removes bias, meaning that physicians can't just choose their preference. Everybody is going to be randomized on an equal basis. It gives balance to the results, so an even number of patients get assigned to each treatment. And the goal here is to see if this new treatment is actually better than what's already on the market, so what's already FDA approved and considered standard of care. So we want a large sample size here in order for the results to be significant. Patients are assigned randomly, like a flip of a coin, to distinct treatment arms. I will say that most oncology transplant trials do not involve placebo because we cannot risk giving you nothing. We cannot risk giving you no treatment at all. So that is why patients can be randomized to either the new experimental treatment or the standard of care medical treatment that is already established. Both treatment arms go through the same exact procedures within the clinical trial, the same exact tests, the same exact observations, so as to evenly and equally compare outcomes. And this allows for better assessment of side effects and overall outcomes. So each type and phase of a clinical trial has a different purpose, but each purpose is trying to get to the same answer. Is our hypothesis proven true or false? Initially, we want to know, can humans tolerate the drug or treatment? Are the side effects risks too great to overcome any potential benefits? So that's our phase 1, right? Then we want to know how effective it is at targeting the blood cancer and getting rid of it. Does it come back? Can we extend patients' overall survival? These are the questions that we're asking about in phase 2. And then lastly, is it better than what is available now to patients? Can we change the standard of care approach to treating blood cancer? Those are the questions that we want to answer in our phase 3 clinical trials. So here are the general features of a clinical trial. Now that we understand what a clinical trial is and does and the purpose behind them, what does that mean for you as the patient? What is it that you will be doing or going through in order to receive this new treatment? So your physician will present the clinical trial to you and explain why he or she believes you would be a good candidate for the study. They will go through how the drug is supposed to work and when you will receive it. The research team will follow up with an informed consent document, and this, as we like to call it in research, is the instruction manual of clinical research. This is the document that tells you everything you need to know about the drug, when it's given, the side effects, the procedures and tests that you will go through, who to contact with questions or concerns, what, if any, reimbursements you will receive to compensate you for your time, confidentiality of your data, and of course, stating that all of this is completely voluntary. You are given an ample amount of time, days if needed, to make your decision. And if you decide to participate, you will then sign the informed consent form with research staff present. So once that informed consent is signed, you will then enter into what is called the screening period. Here, research staff are going to conduct and perform several tests. Some actually may have already been done for standard of care purposes to confirm you are eligible to participate in the study. Each clinical trial has a list of criteria that patients must and cannot meet. It is the research investigator and staff's responsibility to collect all of the appropriate data and tests to confirm your eligibility. So once confirmed eligible, you will begin and receive the treatment. So here's your on-treatment visit. Your research staff will inform you of how often you have to come into the clinic, when you will have to receive the treatment, and any additional procedures that will need to be done in addition to your standard of care visits. So for example, at Northside Hospital, we try to have all of our research visits occur on the same day that you're actually already coming into clinic for a standard of care visit. So it's to try not to inconvenience you anymore for participating on a research trial. Once treatment is completed, or if we need to take you off the study for any particular reason, you will then move into the follow-up period. So these are your off-treatment visits. Most of these visits can happen by research staff receiving records from outside facilities or calling you to check on you. This data is collected for survival purposes and to see if you're taking any subsequent cancer treatments. Okay, so now we're on to the how questions, and these are the questions that we want to address. How are clinical trials different than standard medical treatment? How are clinical trials reviewed and deemed appropriate for patient participation? How are patients selected and evaluated to participate in a clinical trial? How are patients monitored and evaluated during their participation in a clinical trial? How are patients monitored and evaluated during, how are clinical trials funded? Sorry about that. Okay. So here is a comparison between clinical trials and standard medical treatment. So clinical trials are considered experimental, as the drug we are testing is not yet FDA approved, right? We're testing the medication to find out those particular results. Standard medical treatment is actually already established and FDA approved for use in that particular indication. So results are already proven and tested several times over for this standard medical treatment. Clinical trials require patients to volunteer to participate, to receive this particular treatment, and to give their informed consent for that participation. Physicians give patients options for their certain conditions, which actually could include a clinical trial. If you decide to go that standard of care route, your physician is going to choose the best course of action for you, whatever type of treatment he or she feels is best for you. For clinical trials, if you choose to participate, you will receive the protocol treatment, and you will need to abide by those guidelines and those rules. The most important part to remember is that standard medical treatment, along with all of the supportive care measures, for example, how to treat nausea and vomiting after transplant, all came about because of clinical trials. Clinical trials and the questions they answer help establish standard of care treatment, algorithms, and procedures for transplant and blood cancer. So how are clinical trials different? So in this graphic, I've split out the different types of clinical trials based on the types of treatment that they give. There are chemotherapy trials where we're testing new drugs to help kill cancer cells, or and patients will either be newly diagnosed, meaning that they just found out that they have this particular blood cancer, and now we want to give them this chemotherapy to kill those blood cancer cells. Or your disease has come back, so it has relapsed. Your cancer has come back, or your cancer is not responding to that initial treatment. For transplant, examples of clinical trials is that we're looking at new graft versus host disease treatment or preventing graft versus host disease, or we're looking at a new conditioning regimen. So the chemotherapy that you received prior to transplant, maybe there's something new that we can add into this particular regimen that will help prevent your disease from coming back, or will give you better outcomes, or will reduce some of the side effects that you could experience after transplant. Another example is giving a standard medication earlier to prevent infections. So for example, instead of starting an antibacterial medication on day +5 after your transplant, we're giving it to you on day -1 right before your transplant to see if we can help prevent that infection from coming about. And our last set of clinical trials, or types of clinical trials, is kind of considered the new kid on the block. So these are our immune effector cell therapies. So here is where we're actually taking either your immune cells and regenerating them, inserting like a new computer code essentially to help recognize your individual cancer cells and kill them. Or we can take a healthy donor, whether it's related to you or unrelated to you, and take their immune cells to help recognize your particular blood cancer and kill off those cells. It's also important to note that by participating in a clinical trial, one of the differences compared to standard of care medical treatment is that your evaluation while under a clinical trial is probably going to be a little bit more frequent, maybe a little bit more intense than what standard medical treatment what we would do for standard medical treatment. And that's just because, again, standard medical treatment, we have proven results. We know what to expect with this particular treatment. With clinical trial medication, we're still trying to answer those questions. So that's why we're asking patients to come in a little bit more frequently to clinic, to stay a little bit longer, to make sure that all potential side effects are observed and taken care of, and obviously to make sure that our patients are safe and okay after those medications are given. So how are clinical trials reviewed and deemed appropriate for patient participation? So a lot going on here. Initially, before the trial even gets to our phase 1, there's a lot of background review. So like I was saying, there's a lot of animal testing that goes on, a lot of testing that goes on in the lab. This is how we develop that scientific question, our hypothesis. What is it that we're trying to answer? We're getting those scientific results. So this is your phase 1 data. And all of these protocols, all of these clinical trials are designed by experts in the field. These are not just some scientists that are thinking up a question. They actually do have experience in the hematology, oncology, transplant world and are genuinely trying to figure out the answer to a question to help better patient outcomes. Clinical trials also go through extensive scientific reviews. So even to get to a phase 1 clinical trial, you have to have FDA approval. The FDA has to give you the okay to proceed in order for the clinical trial to get off the ground. The FDA will be looking at all of those lab-based results, all of those scientific results that happened before the trial was ever introduced to humans to ensure that the trial is safe for human participation. While the trial is going on, there are several committees that review the data, that go through the results on an ongoing basis. So you have your oversight committees and your steering committees. They're reviewing the data constantly. They're having meetings weekly, bi-weekly, on a monthly basis to ensure that everybody is aware of the data, everyone is aware of the results, and they can either move forward with the next dose in a phase 1 trial, or they can continue with the trial in phase 2, phase 3. Lastly, you also have your ethics review. So this is all about human subject protection, making sure that human subjects that are participating in a clinical trial are protected. Not just their data in meaning like confidentiality, but that the risks of the trial do not outweigh the benefits, that there will, in some regard, be some benefit to patients in participating in this trial. And that's done by your institutional review board. So in order for a clinical trial to be approved at a certain center, Northside Hospital, for example, you have to have an institutional review board review and approve the trial to be conducted at that particular site. So now we're asking, how are patients selected and evaluated for a clinical trial? A lot goes into this, especially from your physician. So your physician is the one that is reviewing your records up front. So we're looking at your basic eligibility criteria here. Do you have the correct blood cancer diagnosis for this clinical trial? Did you receive the appropriate amount of treatment? How are your lab values? We're just looking at this basic criteria before we even discuss the clinical trial with you as a participant. If we note that you do meet this basic eligibility criteria, your physician is going to talk to you about the clinical trial, give you all of that upfront information about when the drug is given, what the drug is supposed to do, what are the potential side effects of the drug, everything like that. So that way you are completely informed about the trial, about the drug, so you can make your decision. If you do decide to participate, you sign that informed consent. You go through that screening process. So that's where all of your labs are being done. We conduct a physical exam. Any certain types of required procedures like a bone marrow biopsy or any scans that are required. Now we're looking in that in-depth eligibility criteria. So the clinical trial actually lists out several specific criteria that patients either need to meet or not meet. And it's all based on your history. So the type of treatment that you have received previously. If you have had any certain medical history conditions, such as a heart attack or a stroke, or do you have hypertension? Is your blood pressure controlled? Things like this, we're going to be looking through your history in order to confirm if you are eligible or not. So now you have been deemed eligible to participate in a trial. So how are you monitored while you are participating in this clinical trial? So we have all kinds of people reviewing everything that is going on with this clinical trial. So we'll start first with the physician review. So every time that you come into clinic, whether it is for the clinical trial research visit, or if it is for your standard of care, or if it's for a standard of care visit, we are looking at your lab results. We are reviewing all of the side effects that you're reporting to us. Your study team is asking you questions. Your regular nurses are asking you questions. We just want to make sure that your safety is priority here. We also have a third-party review. So here, this is where your oversight committee comes in. So this is where an external oversight committee is reviewing all the data. So it's good to have these types of committees because they're impartial. They don't know you. They don't know us as a clinical research team. They are just purely looking at the data to see how patients are responding to this particular treatment. We also have the study sponsor for review. Study sponsors review all the data entered into our database. And then we also, again, have that ethics review. So they're reviewing any unexpected events. They're making sure that informed consent is comprehensive. How are clinical trials funded? So there are industry sponsors So you can have industry sponsors, such as pharmaceutical companies. That's what that means. So you have your big ones like Bristol Myers Squibb or Johnson & Johnson, Sanofi. Those are the ones that are developing the clinical trial and asking sites to participate. There are also government-sponsored ones, like the National Institute of Health or the National Cancer Institute sponsor trials. And then they're also investigator-initiated. So it's very possible that your clinical research team, your physician, has developed this protocol on his or her own. They want to know the answer to this particular question that is appropriate for their patient population. Okay, so why are clinical trials stopped early? Why do clinical trials use placebo? And why should you participate in a clinical trial? So here are our why questions. So it is possible that clinical trials could be stopped early, and there are several reasons. I'm going to highlight 3 of them here. It's possible that there are side effects that are much more prevalent than what we have seen in lab studies. So we're constantly reviewing the risk versus benefit analysis. Are the risks outweighing the benefits, or vice versa? We want to make sure that the benefits are outweighing the risks. But it's very possible that these treatments have too much toxicity, and patients need to come off the trial, and the clinical trial needs to stop. It's also possible that clinical trials have stopped early because we're seeing really great results. We're already proving that it's better than routine care, and we can fast track this particular treatment to FDA approval. And lastly, it could be a sponsored decision. I will say for Northside Hospital, we've recently had to close some clinical trials because the sponsor has decided to reprioritize their resources, and they can no longer fund this particular trial. It's also possible that there's slow enrollment, that we're just not finding the right patients for this clinical research study. So why do clinical trials use placebo? So like I said, those phase 3 clinical trials, that's your gold standard for clinical research. We're randomizing patients because we want to reduce the bias. So we're flipping a coin to see which treatment that you will receive. There's also blinded versus unblinded. So this means that we don't have a choice between the treatment that you were going to get. So there, again, here's your less bias. And there's a cause and effect as well. There's a relationship between the treatment and its outcome. And we can show reliable evidence that there might be this relationship between this new treatment and its outcome. This leads to more reliable evidence for clinical decision-making about the treatment your physician wants to give you. Our last question for why. So, having received all this information, why should you participate in a clinical trial? You are still going to receive expert medical care, no matter what decision you make, whether it is to participate on a clinical trial or if it is to receive standard medical care, you're still going to receive medical care. The unique thing about a clinical trial is that you're going to gain access to the latest treatments and techniques. Like I said, that new kid on the block, the immune effector cell treatment, all of that is in the clinical research world right now. And that is how you're able to access those latest treatments, by participating in a clinical trial. You could also contribute to medical advancement, help future patients, and that's a big thing for a lot of patients, is that you don't want anybody else to go through this. So let's try to figure out how can we make this better for the patients in the future. There are some things to consider when you participate in a clinical trial, that your time commitment could be a little bit longer. You might be required to come in to the clinic a little bit more frequently than what would be required for standard medical treatment. You might have to go through some additional tests, procedures for a clinical research trial. And it's also possible for you to consider second opinions. If this is the only option that we are able to offer you, you can always look somewhere else, look at a different center to see what other options are available to you. And just as a reminder, sponsors are trying to offset costs for patients. They're trying to do a little bit better job of this now, in my personal opinion. in trying to reimburse you for parking, meals, and mileage, just to help you out a little bit, because coming to the clinic every day and paying $10 for parking every day, that adds up. So I have seen this in that they're definitely trying to help patients in that way. Okay, we are almost done here. So here we go with our last section, our where questions. So where can you find out results of a clinical trial, and where can you find out more information about a clinical trial? So results of a clinical trial are usually available on clinicaltrials.gov. However, they are not available on that website until after the study has completely done. So all patients have participated, they have completed their follow-up, everything is said and done. So it's very possible that it takes years, 5, 6, 7, 8+ years for these results to become available. Sometimes sponsors provide information to the clinical research teams in order for them to disseminate that information to patients. It's also possible that your study physician can give you that information as well. If you do want to find out some more information about clinical trials, here are some websites for you to visit. Clinicaltrials.gov is always a great one to review. You can type in certain words and see which clinical trials pop up. The Leukemia and Lymphoma Society also has a list of clinical trials. Of course, you can always go to bntinfonet.org to find out more. You can also visit your local hospital, university, or clinic websites. And then social media. A lot of clinical trial teams are posting on social media in order to promote the clinical trials that are available at their centers. And I just want to leave everybody with this. If you are considering and participating in a clinical trial, these are some useful questions to ask your clinical team, your physician, your nurses, your coordinators. What is being researched, and how is the treatment given? How long do you have to stay in clinic in order to receive the treatment? Will you need to make extra trips in order to see your doctor? Do you have to pay for any part of the trial? Will my insurance cover treatment if you participate in the trial? Will you be able to see your own doctor? Can I change my mind and withdraw a trial at any time? And what if the treatment doesn't work for you? Or what if you have any bad side effects? What happens then? What happens to your medical care when the trial is over or finished? Just some questions to keep in mind if you're considering a research trial. And I would be happy to take any questions at this time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Guzowski. That was a great presentation, very comprehensive. We do have some questions in the queue. However, if you have a question you would like Caitlin to answer, please type it into the chat box on the left-hand side of your screen, and we'll be able to get to as many questions as we can. So let's start with the first question. I'm definitely interested in participating in a clinical trial when my multiple myeloma relapses. How do I go about researching what's available to get into a database for people interested now so that I can avoid delays when the disease relapses, becomes refractory to my current line of treatment?
So I would definitely look at your local university, your local hospital, to see if they have any clinical trials available. Another way you can go actually about this is if you go to clinicaltrials.gov and you type in multiple myeloma into the search box, you can actually filter out the clinical trials that are only participating in your state. So that will at least narrow it down. They also on clinicaltrials.gov, they give you a list of contacts at those particular sites. So you can email the study physician directly to say, hi, I'm interested in this clinical trial when my disease relapse. I really want to get in your queue when this trial would be an option for me.
That is true. Clinicaltrials.gov does have a lot of information. I do know, however, that a lot of patients find it very difficult to use. I would suggest that you might want to reach out to the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, who have patient navigators to help you locate clinical trials. They're able to translate a lot of that very complex information you see on clinicaltrials.gov into more easily understood language and help you sort out which trials might be worth pursuing. So I would definitely give Leukemia and Lymphoma Society a call or email them for help on that. The second question is, does insurance cover clinical trials, and what happens if they don't?
So it does really depend on your insurance if they cover clinical trials or not. And that's something that at Northside Hospital, we're very fortunate to have an oncology business office that does a lot of that legwork for us. If your insurance does not cover clinical trials, for Northside Hospital, what we do is we actually are able to provide financial assistance to patients so that way they can participate on a clinical trial. Now, it's very possible that it's just the insurance won't cover certain procedures that are in that clinical trial. And if that's the case, we have always gone back to the study sponsor, so the pharmaceutical company who's funding the trial, and asked them to cover those specific procedures in order for a patient to participate. And they're usually very amenable to that.
That's good to know. Thank you. Next question is, what happens if the drug being tested in a clinical trial is actually less effective than standard therapy?
So if we see that in a phase 3 trial, then the study treatment research is stopped at that time. If we cannot prove that there is a benefit to receiving this treatment over than what is already approved, the clinical trial is stopped. The research on that particular treatment is done, and it doesn't go to the FDA to get approval.
All right, thank you. Next question. Are all the drugs that are used during transplant and CAR T-cell therapy FDA approved? And if not, why not?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Yes, are all the drugs that are used during transplant and CAR T-cell therapy approved by the FDA? And if they're not, why not? I think this person may be referring to like off-label use of drugs.
I see. So all drugs that are used in transplant and CAR T-cell therapy they do have an FDA-approved label. Now, it is possible for physicians to use them off-label. So, for example, giving it earlier in the transplant process than what is standardly approved. And I guess I don't really have a great answer into why it's not FDA, how physicians are able to do that without having that FDA approval. I do not know how to answer that question.
Okay, well that's fine. If you don't know the answer, that's your answer.
Yeah.
All right. The next question is, can I enroll in a clinical trial if I'm not currently at a transplant or CAR T center? Can my local doctor enroll me in a clinical trial?
So your local doctor would have to be participating in that clinical trial. So that particular center would need to be a site in participating in that trial. It's possible that your local doctor might be a part of a larger network. So, for example, Northside Hospital has several community oncologists that work underneath the big umbrella of Northside Hospital, and those local oncologists are able to enroll patients to a clinical trial because they are affiliated with Northside Hospital. I don't know how that works with your local oncologist. If your local oncologist is not part of a bigger network that has access to clinical research trials, I would definitely suggest asking your local physician about being referred to a center that does have clinical trials, and specifically the ones that you're looking for.
All right, the next question is, why is there not more collaboration in clinical trials with different medical institutions? There are so many trials limited to geographical areas that are inaccessible to many people that would qualify. It would be great to have the trial available across the country in various areas so more people could participate.
I completely agree with you. I do know that pharmaceutical companies are limited in the amount of sites that they can have participate in a research study, and that's purely due to funding. How many sites can they pay in order to run this clinical trial? And I do know that there is probably some bias in the bigger institutions like the MD Andersons, the City of Hopes of the world. So I know that it is difficult for patients that don't live near those big centers in order to participate in clinical trials. I do believe now, and probably the past couple of years now, there has been more of an effort to get clinical trials into areas where there isn't a major institution, so that way more patients can have access. I think it's still a work in progress, and it's something that it will continue to need to be worked on. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's going to take years in order for that to happen, but I do know that they are trying to work on it currently.
All right, then we have a couple questions. How much more time does a clinical trial typically take for a patient as compared to standard therapy? I think they're trying to assess how much extra time they need to build into their schedule.
So I think it really depends. I don't know if I can give you an average amount of time. For a particular day, if we're just talking about a 24-hour period when you're going to clinic, it's very possible that your standard medical treatment, it might only be a 4-hour visit. But for clinical research trial, we might be talking upwards of 6 to 8 hours, just because the clinical trial might mandate that we have to collect samples 2, 4, 6 hours after you get the research drug. Because we're trying to see how that research drug is working in your system. Is it still active 2 hours later? Is it still active 4 hours later? Is it still active 6 hours later? So it really depends on the clinical trial and what's mandated in the clinical trial. And from my experience, in just looking in general at clinical trial versus standard medical treatment, I will say that I believe that you come to clinic a little bit more often. If we're talking about a cycle, which is 28 days, I would say you're probably in clinic 3 to 4 extra days a month during that cycle than you would be for standard medical treatment. And that's purely for observational purposes. We obviously want to make sure that you're okay. If you're experiencing any side effects from the research drug, we want to know about it. We want to take care of you. We want to record that information, so that way we can send to the sponsor.
Well, that's very helpful to know. We have one last question. If you do have any questions, now is the time to type them in. Otherwise, we'll wrap up with this last question. Can I drop out of a clinical trial if I change my mind or if I have some bad side effects?
Yes, of course. Research is always optional. So yes, you are able to, it's voluntary to participate at the beginning. And even if you do start participating and you don't like the side effects, or you don't like that you're coming to clinic an extra 3 to 4 days a month, you have the option to withdraw your consent at any time throughout that entire process.
Great, good to know. Well, with that note, I think we'll end the workshop. On behalf of BMT InfoNet and our partners, I'd like to thank Caitlin for breaking down clinical trials and explaining their importance. And thank you to the audience for your excellent questions. Please contact BMT InfoNet if we can help you in any way, and enjoy the rest of the symposium. Have a great day.